anybody doesn't know, I'm Diane Stepro, and I am the Genealogy and Local History Librarian at Jeffersonville Township Public Library. And one of the first things that happened when I started at this job was that my then negotiated to get us, make us part of this Discover Indiana Tours. And Discover Indiana Tours is an online tour program through the Public History Department at Indiana University, Purdue University of Indianapolis. And most of their tours were in the Indianapolis area because they've been able to send their grad students out to write them. And they have, I think, one in Vincennes, which is where I'm from. But that was about it. Our end of the state had, I think, New Albany, somebody from New Albany had done a couple. I don't think the library had taken part. They really neglected our end of the state quite a bit. And so they were seeking partners from other parts of the state because they really couldn't send people down here to do research. So we took that on, and the whole project is funded by a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And things went wrong with that, and it was put off and put off. And finally, it all came through last spring, and then we shut down and we were in quarantine, and I had no way to hire anybody to write these things and take the pictures. I got one other librarian who works here to take some of the pictures, but it ended up being my quarantine project. Other people started sourdough and I wrote these tours. So that's what happened. I guess you probably made trains, Mr. Pettit, and made train landscapes, and people did their thing while they were locked in, and this is what I did. I'm going to share my screen to show what this is, but before I do that, let me tell you that the best way to view these, if you've got a cell phone, is to download the app. There's a Discover Indiana Tour app, and if you type those words into Google, Discover Indiana Tour app, it'll take you to the Google Play Store. Do it on your phone, and you ought to be able to get through that and download the app. And it goes much more smoothly than if you are trying to just look at it online. We're going to do it online tonight, so I make sure I actually see what's there because I'm not sure I'd be able to read it off my cell phone. But that way you can walk through the tours with your phone in your hand, or drive through them with your phone on your dashboard, and it works pretty well. If you are like me and you absolutely detest your cell phone and aren't really sure how to download an app, I can do that much, but I detest my cell phone. Jeffersonville Township Public Library has a librarian whose job it is to teach people how to use their cell phones. Poor guy. But he loves it, and he would be happy to talk to you. His name is Stuart Jones, and his direct number is 812-285-8600. That's 285-8600. So call Stuart and tell him you need help with your cell phone. He'll make an appointment with you. He'll walk you through it over the phone, whatever. So I'm going to share my screen now. And move that a bit. Okay, so if you go to Discover Indiana, here's the opening part online, and you go to tours, you'll get a list of all 34 tours that are currently there, and they are putting this year's crop in right now. So if you go tomorrow, it might be 35. And they're in the order they were added. So you've got to scroll to the bottom to see ours, because ours are two of the most recent. One came in between them. But the first is Orphans of Clark County, Remembering and Rediscovering a County's Lost Children. And I was really interested in doing this tour because one thing we've been doing here at Jeff Library is trying to reconstruct our lost orphanage records. There were at least 2 orphanages that we have been able to discover. I won't say there's never been any other kind of institution in Clark County. And and nobody knows where the records are, but there are two things that tell us a lot about them. One is newspapers, and the other is juvenile court records. And so we've been making a spreadsheet of orphans, and everything we could find out about them, who their parents were before they were orphaned, who their parents were if they were adopted, what orphanage or institution did they go to. And so I'm kind of telling you what's in the narrative, but that's all listed here. A lot of the kids really suffered horribly. There was absolutely nothing that we can find that was done for kids before 1876 besides placing them in people's homes, and terrifyingly that was done by just making an ad in the paper. Would anybody like a kid? We've got one. Sort of like that. And then you didn't know who was getting those kids. So we stitched together all kinds of information to get these kids' lives sort of recorded. For a couple of kids, with the help of a young librarian who lives in Indianapolis and had become fascinated with the particular local family. We have a lot of information. For others, we just have a little. But there are a bunch of stops on the tour. And if you get down to the bottom of the page here, you'll see the stops. There are 7. And I'm going to go through a little bit here. Founding of the orphanage and moved to Megs Avenue. So the first orphanage was at Megs Avenue. And I'm not going to go through the entire list here, but what I'm going to do is go down to the images, because I want you to see what happens when you click on the images. So you'll see, if you are familiar with Kingfish Restaurant, this is the apartment complex across from Kingfish. It is the spot of the original orphanage. That building was destroyed by a tornado in the late 1900s. But it was only used for a few years as an orphanage. But it was, at the time, it was called the First Street Orphanage because it was at the corner of First and Front, I believe. So we are absolutely certain that it was abandoned by June 1st of 1880, because the first time we find orphans in the census listed as orphanage asylum residents was June 1st of 1880. This is the second orphanage. It too is now gone. It was completed around 1880. It increased the capacity to 45 children of both genders. That was a problem for orphanages around the country when they had to mix ages and genders. In most smaller localities like Jeffersonville, only in very large communities could they separate people by age and gender, and that just left kids vulnerable to a lot of abuse, because a 12-year-old bully and a 3-year-old in the same facility, obviously leads to problems. In that first census of the orphanage, we did not find them at nearly capacity. Later on in 1920, we found this orphanage at 20 children. So it was rarely filled but 20 children without homes seems to me to be a lot for Jeffersonville. But one thing you need to realize is that a lot of these kids were not true orphans. They would be removed from the home by the courts, often if they were not cared for, or even if the parents, if there was a single parent, usually because there was a widow or widower trying to care for the children, and they were left to tend for themselves and were failing, there would be a removal. And people often would reclaim their children once they remarried and had a spouse to stay home with them back then. One of the people who was instrumental to organizing this was Hannah Zuloff. This is her grave monument. We don't have a picture of Hannah, but she was also the person who raised the money for the construction of Jeffersonville's original public library, the Carnegie. So she was a very active person in the community. This is a map of the city of Jeffersonville. This is a fire insurance map from the Sanborn Company, and it shows the streets on which both the first and second orphanages were located. These streets were Front Street and Canal Street originally. You'll see Canal over here and Front here. They are currently called Riverside Drive and Megs Avenue. You know, sadly, there's not a lot left from that time in Jeffersonville. There are a lot of buildings lost over the years. Of course, everybody knows we had a bit of a flood in the interim. This is a copy of that 1880 census that showed us the first orphans' names and allowed us to start our list of orphans from Jeffersonville. And, you know, one of the nice things about a census is we find out where the kids were born. So you'll see it's pretty consistent. Most of them were born in Indiana. And in some cases, we got the places where, from censuses, we got the places where their parents were born. And that helped us match them up with people that were their parents, their biological parents. You'll notice, if you could see this, and you probably can't because frankly I can't read it on my screen, but this image shows their ages. There is no one over 12, and that's because in the early orphanage system, typically children were farmed out to work at 12. They were considered old enough to be somebody's servant, and there wasn't a whole lot of vetting. It was more like, oh, you could use somebody to work for you and you promise to teach them a useful skill. Great, take a kid, take two. And we found a lot of evidence that some of those homes were very abusive. Those kids were not protected in the same way people would protect their own kids, even if they were fairly good. They were rarely like adoptive homes that these older kids went to. Now, some of the younger kids were adopted by people that really raised them quite well, but you'll find kids listed as adopted or servant, either one, when they've been farmed out as older children. They usually don't get quite the same treatment. When they adopted, at that time, it was ordinary for people not to actually tell the census taker they were adopted. It was a big secret. So we usually, but the newspaper knew no secrets. So we usually, when we do know about them, we know because the newspaper said, you know, Dr. Smith adopted little Betty Turner from the orphanage last weekend. So And this is the private Holt Orphanage, which was founded just to support the Masons children from all over the state, primarily southern Indiana, but they could be anywhere in Indiana. And it was not uncommon at all for different civic groups and other groups to found their own orphanages, often with the goal of treating them better than they would have got treated at a public orphanage. And so the Holt kids, from what we could tell, had fairly comfortable lives and got to do a lot of ordinary things. The next stop. Setbacks and Tragedies. So I start with a picture of the location. This is a church on Megs Avenue where the city orphanage in Jeffersonville once stood. You know, I mentioned that most of the kids were from born in Indiana. There was a stereotype at the time that they were mostly foreign born, but that just wasn't the case here. This is a obituary for a little girl, Lizzie Boyer. Lizzie, at age 12, died of a spine disorder. The census noted her condition as back broken, but they called it a spine disorder in the paper. Who knows what was right, but there was no such thing as a death certificate yet. They began in 1882, but here in Clark County, but she may well have had tuberculosis, because that was once a very common cause of spine disease. They called it Pott's disease, and the tuberculosis would actually infect the spine and erode the bone, and was ordinarily fatal. Further searching in the census made us believe that she was the child of Alex Boyer of Charlestown, because he had a child named Elizabeth in the 1870 census. And we're not sure why she was placed in the orphanage. This is a really common thing that you'd see. There was no privacy for children who were removed from their homes, or parents that have been charged with neglect and had their children removed. It's always right in the paper with all the names, and now at least they usually suppress the children's names. And in this case, as is often the case with children who are placed in the orphanage, they are the child of a widower. So Mary Elizabeth and Ivy Mae Sayre had one living parent who could not care for them and work. According to the Evening News of September 16, 1919, a county probation officer placed the children ages 5 and 3 in the orphanage. Their father was charged to pay for their care. I think they were reunited, because years later, I found the only Mary Sayre and Thomas Sayre I could find were living together as father and daughter in Cincinnati, which was a common place for people to move to from this area, since it was just down the river. We don't know what happened to little Ivy. And on July 4th of 1878, the National Democrat noted the passing of Lizzie Curtis, an orphan. She killed herself by consuming arsenic. There were quite a few, in 1878 to about 1890, there were quite a few poison deaths, deliberate poison deaths in this area. We think her younger sister was Ida Curtis, who was adopted by George Brown of Bartholomew County, and we lost track of her at that point. We presume he changed her name and perhaps moved, because we've not been able to locate a George with an Ida. Either that or he changed her first name too. We're not really certain. Another problem was that they found work for children all over the place. We found Jeffersonville children sent quite far away, down in the far south of Kentucky, and then this one went to Indianapolis. So they found work for this young man named Virgil Brannon. His parents died in Memphis, Indiana, and he had the presence of mind to find the police station when someone employed to take him to his new place of employment failed to show up at the train station. I can't imagine. I've been in Union Station in Indianapolis, and I think it's big. I can't imagine being a 13-year-old in 1896 and having the presence of mind to go find help. I really, this one was a really sad story, but we don't know what happened to him. The paper just dropped the story, but he did not ever get a notice letting us know that he'd found his employer. So who knows? Before children were sentenced to the orphanage, the juvenile court assigned children to orphanages. They might be held in the county jail. So we found the Roderoff children removed from their home. They were described as wearing rags, and they were held at the jail. And that was a major problem in 19th century America all over, that children were often placed in jails and prisons for absolutely nothing, and sometimes in places where adult criminals had unrestricted access to them, which just seems to defeat the purpose of taking children out of the homes of people who couldn't afford to take care of them. Sometimes people voluntarily committed their children because they couldn't take care of them. In this case, we have the Taylors, Charles Taylor and Elnora, were committed to the orphanage, but the mother kept her other children after their father had deserted them and wasn't supporting them because they were too sick, and she didn't want them to come to court that day. And so that kind of tells you how desperate people were to find someone to care for their children. Now, I mentioned that there was a family that we were very interested in because of the research of a young librarian from Indian. She's from Jeffersonville originally, but lives in Indianapolis now. And Belle Moore was the first of the children in that family to reach her attention, and Belle is something. I'm going to read Belle's story to you, and I'm not going to read every bit of the orphanage tour to you in the interest of time, but I'm going to read Belle's to you. Belle Morin is an example of the incomplete and often contradictory evidence available about orphans' lives. Born in 1867, Belle may have been surrendered sometime around 1875 by her biological mother, Sally Crum Moore, a Jeffersonville native, due to the death of her father, William Moore. Her mother eventually remarried, this time to German immigrant Louis Ulrich, but the newlyweds did not rush to reclaim Belle. Most of Belle's history comes from sensational newspaper accounts of her scandalous misadventures from 1883 to 1885. According to Louisville's Courier-Journal of November 6th and 9th, 1883, Frankfort, Kentucky area farmer Milton Craig adopted Moore as a nanny for his children. When Craig and his wife had business away from the farm, a neighbor, Marcus Cromwell, raped Moore, leaving her pregnant. Cromwell denied the assault. He defended himself to reporters by asserting the 13-year-old girl was a seductress and portraying himself as a respectable father and grandfather. He indicated, Craig, this is the guy who had taken her as a nanny, indicated support for Moore's story. He really believed that Cromwell had raped her. And the Courier-Journal bemoaned the fact that Cromwell faced no charges because, this is quite shocking, Kentucky had no law against seducing an unmarried girl. In fact, for many purposes, the law considered poor teenagers like Moore adults, but offered them few protections. Soon after, Moore reported that the Craig family physically abused her. She fled to Jeffersonville when assaults became unbearable. She was being beaten. Within a few weeks, Moore was arrested for antics outside her stepfather's house, including dressing in boys' clothing and drawing a crowd of spectators. Family members claimed she'd been keeping them awake with singing and dancing, and she threatened her stepfather's life. Moore's family called for an inquest or hearing into her sanity. And we got the inquest from the courthouse. The inquest judged an adult's mental health. So they were judging her as if she was an adult because she was 13. A finding of insane could result in confinement to the state's hospital. Moore avoided confinement and walked free after the inquest. I really love that the inquest notes that she used profanity eloquently. The November 21st, 1883 Courier-Journal reports that Jeffersonville authorities blame Moore's behavior on the effects of the outrage committed upon her at such a young age. That's the only official recognition of the rape. We get lots of notations in the paper, which love sensational stories, but nothing official, no legal documentation besides what was in the insanity inquest. And nothing recorded the outcome of her pregnancy. We never found a child, so we believe that she lost the baby. In March of 1885, she was again arrested for dressing in male clothing, and she spent one night in jail at least, but the judge released her after a lecture on morals, and within a week, she was arrested again for cursing and raving like a rum maniac. The Courier-Journal called her an outcast, a male impersonator, a hard case who undoubtedly wants to go to the workhouse. We don't know anything about why Mel did what she did, whether she dressed in male clothing because she identified as male, or whether she wanted to, she thought it provided some safety from assault if she looked like a boy, or whether she just liked to wear pants. But what we do know that her arrests demonstrate the struggles orphans could face with their families, neighbors, and law enforcement. They did seem to end up in trouble a lot. This is over by the highway in Jeffersonville by Highway 65, and that is where she was arrested for yelling and screaming and threatening her stepfather. Their house was right around, almost underneath where the highway is now. This is the orphanage that she would have known, if she was ever in an orphanage, it had to be the Megs Avenue orphanage, because she was out of orphanages by 1880. Her brother, however, was at this one. This is a census where she is listed at the Milton Craig family as the nurse and as a 13-year-old child. So she's 13, and she was responsible for the children of the stranger. After she returned to Jeffersonville, she was the janitor at Rose Hill School and slept there in a closet. This is a picture of Rose Hill School around that time. This is 1875, so she was there just a little after. We've never found out what happened to her, but after all the scandals that marked her adolescence, she was found not yet 20, living in a pump house and wearing rags. A bunch of African American women had taken, and with their children had taken her in, and she was sleeping on the floor. It was on East Chestnut Street in Jeffersonville. And we found it really remarkable that what the paper found worth commenting upon was that she was very beautiful, but was wearing socks with holes. And to me, that seemed like a very strange thing to comment upon a child that had no home. And this is the location of the pump house. We believe it was probably destroyed during a late 19th century flood, and this building was put up shortly thereafter. We also have a tour about her brother. I'm not going to read you all of it, but her brother, Frankie Polkmore, or Polkymore, he had a bunch of different nicknames, but Frankie did some time in the penitentiary. He kind of went from the fire to the frying pan. I'll just quickly tell you that he went from the orphanage to back to his stepfather's home. Married, didn't like being married, and tried to kill himself, failed. Very shortly thereafter, got in trouble for stealing, went to the penitentiary, and he didn't live to be very old. I think he was dead before he was 40. And in fact, all of the children of their mother seem to have lived very short lives, which was not very unusual for children who lost a parent at that time. It seems to be very very bad for children to have a parent die. Most people were very much living from hand to mouth. Unwelcome Children is actually about all the children that were not welcome in the orphanage. Roman Catholics and children of color were not typically found in the orphanage. You know, if you watch movies today, they usually have kids of all walks of life and color in a, if you watch the musical Annie or something, there's a variety of children. But in fact, 19th century American orphanages were usually very segregated. If they could afford to, communities segregated by age and gender, as I've mentioned, but almost all segregated by religion and color. And from what we've been able to gather, for most of the history, there was not an orphanage that accepted children that were not white and Protestant in Clark County. Catholic children were generally sent back to my hometown, back to Vincennes, where there was a large Catholic orphanage. African-American children, one of two things happened. They were for a time sent to various orphanages in the general area that did accept African-American children. Also, they could be placed very early in families. They were rarely placed with African-American families, and a lot of times if their own biological family tried to claim a child that was truly orphaned, say an aunt or uncle came, they were denied, and the children were instead placed with a white family. The papers freely disclosed gossip about guardians that were Black, usually stating that they believed that the families were just out for the stipend, but they didn't seem to have the same suspicions about the white families that they were placed with. And I should go back, the county offered a small stipend for the support of an orphan. So it was a pretty racist idea that white people would be more honest with that than Black people who are related to the children. And we know for a fact that children are more likely to do well with their relatives, especially grandparents and aunts and uncles. So St. Augustine was the home to many of the children who were placed elsewhere. This is an article about one of the African-American children whose uncle sought custody of her, and was denied. Instead, she was kept at the home of a German immigrant named Schuler. This is an article about a little boy, an abandoned child, and John Boyer asks that this child asks that the girls that found him take him to the county trustees, and the county trustees would have been the right place to go. They were the people that took care of orphans at that time. The Gilbert children, I've actually been in contact with their descendants. This family, Goebel and Charlotte Gilbert, lived at 421 Broadway, and when the couple had problems, and the husband was away at World War II, Charlotte was the sole caretaker. She was accused of neglect. She refused to go to court, and the children were sent to Vincennes. And interestingly enough, one of them married a relative of mine in Vincennes, so that's how I found out about them. But we've been able to go back and reconstruct a lot of that history that she didn't know. So there we go. The mother went to prison for neglect, remarried, had more children, never reclaimed any of those original children that went to the Vincennes orphanage. Sadly. Another striking story was the story of the O'Neills. Their mother was shot someplace near this address by their father on Christmas Eve. They briefly had a tavern. Her name was Mary Catherine Cameron O'Neill. Or excuse me, yes. Well, that was her name, Mary Catherine Cameron O'Neill. And this is the birth certificate of her child, named for her, Mary Catherine O'Neill. The father tried to defend himself, got a very good criminal lawyer, but he still faced time for the murder. And that meant with no mother and no father, the children had to go someplace. There were 5. And we are missing an image, but the image is St. Vincent's Orphanage in Vincennes. I'll have to talk to Discover, Indiana. St. Vincent's was torn down in my lifetime. I knew people that lived there, that were raised there as children. It was a huge Catholic orphanage that at one time slept hundreds of kids. And at the time that the O'Neills were there, and that's where they went, it housed 130 children, according to the census. This is the draft registration card from Knox County, Indiana, of one of their children named Charles Duffy O'Neill. You can learn a lot from this draft card. It says his place of residence is with Stanton Sievers, care of Stanton Sievers, Rural Route 4. The address he gave is a Knox County farmer. I know Sievers descendants, and I've met some of the O'Neill descendants as well. And I know that the O'Neill children were, as children here were farmed out to people to work, and the Sieverses were the family that that Charles went to, so that was still going on on the eve of World War II. That children were around this country being sent out to work, but all of the kids by this time, they were required, even orphanages that practiced the farming out were required to make sure they went to high school. So they did finish high school. You'll note that for employer, he's not listed as an employer of the Stantons. He's just farm help, like their own kid, or excuse me, of the Sieverses. But he is listed as a high school student. He went to Decker Elementary and high school, I understand. So, and this photo did load. This is the row of beds at St. Vincent's. It was just an enormous orphanage. We don't have any pictures of the inside of the local orphanage, but this gives you some idea of the sleeping quarters. This is a boys' room at St. Vincent's in Vincennes. And I'm going to stop with this, but there are some happier stories and better tidings. And I'm going to go on to the African Americans, and I am running short on time, so I'm just going to look at one African American family. There are a lot of things in here. So at Freedom's Gate, African Americans settling in Clark County. And I will just tell you that this goes from African Americans that came here with the Clarks, including York, who was a participant in the Lewis and Clark expedition and a hero of the expedition. Obadiah Buckner, who was an early challenger of rules that made it difficult for blacks to ride transportation like railroads. In fact, he had began his war with the Jeffersonville Railroad, in a Jeffersonville Railroad station that was located practically under my feet right now. It was right next to the library. It covers lynchings in Clark County. We believe we found 20. It's pretty sad. But I'd like to talk about the Dennings, because the Dennings are really amazing. And it's a story that's just now really coming to light. Over here by the highway, about a block from where the Ulriches lived, and Belle Moore went out dressed as a man and had a fight with her stepfather, was the home of the Dennings when they first moved here from Kentucky. George and Molly Denning, on a winter night, they were forced to abandon their farm Molly was forced to abandon their farm in Simpson, Kentucky, ill-clad and robbed of almost everything she and her children owned. At that time, George, Molly's husband, was in prison for defending his family during an earlier attack. By the end of 1899, the family had settled in the relative safety of Jeffersonville, Indiana, where they hoped to find, I need to fix that, in the relative safety of Indiana. Jeffersonville would remain the couple's home as they fought a legal battle over civil rights and raised children and grandchildren. The formerly enslaved George and Molly owned a tobacco farm and raised a large family. Their modest success attracted covetous eyes, and in 1897, according to the Courier Journal, a KKK mob attacked the family in the night. They fired shots in the house and terrified the children. They shot and injured George pretty severely, but he defended his family, and he ultimately shot and killed one wealthy attacker named Jody Kahn. And at first, papers were sympathetic. They believed the story that he had stolen something. But as more and more information came out, that turned. It was clear that the intention was to kill the family and steal their farm. That the Klan had made up the story about George stealing anything, that he in fact had an extremely prosperous farm and would have no need to steal somebody else's chicken. And that was something that was enacted time and time again in the South, that the Klan attacked successful Black farmers and took their land. And they did take Denning's land. Denning turned himself in, and he and his troops, troops protected him, the county jail. Jody Kahn's friends attacked the jail. They even dynamited it. The Cincinnati Enquirer reported that attacks included dynamite charges aimed at the jail, and despite the violence, a jury convicted Denning. But as I said, outrage grew over his treatment. After he spent 2 weeks in prison, their anti-racist governor in Kentucky, William O'Connell Bradley, granted a full pardon. But Denning lost an eye when immediately after he was released, an unidentified mob assaulted him. He finally joined his family where they'd sought refuge in Jeffersonville, and he sued the attackers, and he won $50,000, which was unheard of in 1899 for an African American to sue the Klan and win. And George and Molly went on to become pretty major landholders in this area. They owned a lot of what's now Jeffersonville. He was a very industrious fellow. They were able to do a lot of that because they were able to claim some of the money. They never get all of the money. But I've spoken to his descendants, and he had several acres that's in Jeffersonville now. So he became kind of a real estate investor. So there again, that's the location of their first home. This is a drawing of George from the Louisville paper. This is the unrepentant Confederate Bennett Young, who served as his attorney. Bennett was a Confederate and did believe in the Confederacy, but he didn't believe in mob rule. He absolutely hated the Klan, and so he was opposed to anything they did, and he defended quite a few African Americans in his time, despite being one of the most avid Confederacy reunion organizers. He practiced in Indiana and in Kentucky. This is Molly's grave. Molly had fallen on hard times after George's death, and apparently because she was buried in the pauper section. We've never located George's exact grave. We're not sure that things were going well when he died, but they did pretty well overall. And immediately after George won his case and was awarded $50,000 in damages, one of his attackers, the wealthiest, went crazy, believed that devils were chasing him, and committed suicide by firing a gun into his own mouth. This is the Dennings when they were on Illinois Avenue in Jeffersonville.
May I have your attention, please? The time is now 7:30.
Hang on just a second.
In 15 minutes at 7:45, the Youth Services Department and the computer labs will close. No more materials will be checked out after 7:55, and the public library will close at 8 p.m.
So obviously I'm at the public library, and you probably heard the announcement that we're closing in half an hour. So I'll wrap this up. So the Dennings had 11 children at home, and several of their children were already adults when they moved here, and the children all came with them. The family is still here in Jeffersonville, and with some members having moved away. And they've been there's some pretty neat people in that family. They've been fun to work with. And there is, I'll end with a little ad for a book. I'm going to come back online and stop the sharing. There is a book out by a Pulitzer Prize winning, Pulitzer Prize nominee named Ben Montgomery, called A Shot in the Moonlight, that details the whole Denning story. It came out just this year, and it's available for checkout at our library, and we are working on a grant to get the author to come read and do a program, and I think it's going to be amazing, and get the family to come too. So there's a lot more to those tours than I showed you. I just gave you one stop on the second tour, but I think we better wrap it up.